Welcome to the Chopin channel. I'm Roberto Poli. Why is it that Chopin, whose command of the piano feels so natural as to be unquestionable, is so often said to have fallen short when writing for the orchestra? I've been hearing this claim since my teens, that his orchestration is thin, that it merely supports the piano rather than engaging with it, that it exposes a kind of limitation. But when we actually listen to his works for piano and orchestra, not just the two concerti, but also the variations on the duet La ci darem la mano from Mozart's Don Giovanni, Opus 2, the fantasy on Polish national airs, Opus 13, or the rondo in F major, Opus 14, called Krakowiak, what is exactly that sounds so inadequate? Is it the extended passages where the piano plays almost alone with only a light string accompaniment? Or is it that we expect a different kind of orchestral presence, shaped by later composers like Brahms, Tchaikovsky, or Rachmaninoff, and judge Chopin against standards that were never really his concern? It may be that what's often called weakness is simply a choice, an orchestra that steps back so the piano can speak more directly, particularly in light of the way Chopin conceived piano writing in melodic passages. And if that's the case, the usual criticism starts to look less like an objective flaw and more like a mismatch between expectation and intention. But there is, of course, much more that tends to elude the listener, and this is not a failure on the listener's part, nor completely the fault of those professional musicians who continue to repeat the commonplace notion that Chopin cannot write for the orchestra. Rather, it arises from a convergence of factors that shape how we hear and judge this music. It's precisely these factors that I'd like to take a closer look at in today's video. Who were Chopin's models when he wrote for piano and orchestra? His frame of reference was necessarily limited to works by his contemporaries and the immediate preceding generation. Chopin's concerti, written between 1829 and 1830, as well as the other works he composed between 1827 and 1828, which I mentioned earlier, Opus 2, 13, and 14, reflect a world shaped above all by contemporary figures such as Johann Nepomuk Hummel, Ignaz Moscheles, and perhaps Friedrich Kalkbrenner. And a little further back, but not by much really, Beethoven and Mozart. If we think about what Chopin could realistically have heard in the 1820s in Warsaw, we are looking at a fairly specific slice of the repertoire, works that were circulating, performed, and admired at the time. We know that in his youth, he greatly respected Hummel and Moscheles, and that Hummel's concerti in A minor and B minor, written in 1816 and 1819 respectively, were part of his repertoire. It's in fact to Hummel that Chopin seems to look in shaping his use of the orchestra within the piano concerto form, particularly in the slow movements or in melodic sections like a second theme, where the instrumental writing often serves to frame and gently support the piano rather than compete with it. Compare this moment from the second theme in the first movement of the Concerto in B minor, Opus 89 by Hummel, for example, in particular the structure of the left-hand accompaniment. To the second theme in the first movement of Chopin's first piano concerto, Opus 11. And if we listen to the opening theme in Hummel's Concerto in A minor, opus 85, we may recognize where the opening of Chopin's E minor concerto came from. Chopin may also have been familiar with the first piano concerto of Kalkbrenner, with whom he later developed a friendship after settling in Paris. In his correspondence, he praised Kalkbrenner in strikingly emphatic terms, at one point suggesting that next to him, everyone else was a zero. It was to Kalkbrenner, in fact, that he dedicated the first piano concerto when it was published in Paris in 1832 by the Schlesinger firm. As for Beethoven, the most likely concerti Chopin would have known during his youth are the third, fourth, and fifth. These were the works most actively performed at the time and regarded as part of the modern, serious repertoire. The first two piano concerti existed, of course, but were less central to concert life by the 1820s. As far as Mozart, the situation is a bit broader, but also less precisely documented. Chopin could have encountered the last six piano concerti, but particularly the ones in D minor and C minor, which were more widely performed in the early 19th century. More generally, Chopin's exposure would have come not just from public concerts, but also from scores, salon performances, and teaching repertoire. So even if he didn't hear all these in concert, he almost certainly knew them in some form. When we compare Chopin's orchestration, keeping in mind that he was still a teenager, to Beethoven's in the piano concerti, the difference is not nearly as striking as it is often made out to be. The instrumentation is broadly similar in weight, and so, to a large extent, is the role assigned to the orchestra. Let's hear a brief example, beginning with an excerpt from the rondo of Beethoven's Concerto No. 4 in G major, opus 58, completed in 1806, the first tutti in fortissimo. And now the first tutti in fortissimo from Chopin's rondo in F major, opus 14, Krakowiak, written in 1828. It's worth keeping the timeline in mind here. Only a little over 20 years separate these two works. Imagine you're writing a piano concerto today, and your point of reference for orchestration, texture, etc., is music written around 2005. Works close enough in time to feel current, familiar, almost part of the same musical air you breathe. We can see then that when Chopin chooses to write an orchestral passage of real substance, he's not only perfectly capable of doing so, but also his orchestration is in no way inferior to that of Beethoven in his concerti. It's equally revealing to look at those moments where the piano comes to the foreground and the orchestra recedes into a more coloristic role, the strings laying down a harmonic backdrop for the soloist, for example. Here is a passage from the first movement of Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto. What we notice is that in some of the piano's active passages, in Beethoven, often simple arpeggiations or rising and falling patterns, the piano is supported primarily by sustained harmonies in the strings with minimal involvement from the woodwinds. In this respect, the texture is similar to what we encounter in Chopin's concerti. Extended episodes in which the strings, particularly, play an exclusively coloristic role in support of the melodic material presented by the piano. And yet, no one seems inclined to accuse Beethoven of being a poor orchestrator. Perhaps that's because he also wrote symphonies and other orchestral works in which his command of the medium is undeniable, and this broader context retroactively validates the more restrained, pared-down writing in the concertos, where the orchestra is at times deliberately reduced in weight and intensity. Chopin's works for piano and orchestra, all written in his teens and when he was 20 years old, clearly draw on models already present in the repertoire. Not only the piano concerti of Beethoven, but also a broader range of works that helped shape both his orchestration and his sense of form. A particularly telling example is the set of variations for piano and orchestra of Mozart's La ci darem la mano opus 2 from 1827. Here, to us, Chopin stands out as a teenager of great genius. But we may simply be unaware of the context found in repertoire now unfamiliar to us. In fact, he may well have had in mind the Alexander Variations, opus 32, by Ignaz Moscheles, written just 6 years earlier in 1821. The overall design is strikingly similar. An opening introduction with an orchestral tutti, followed by the piano in an extended improvisation. The theme is then stated and is treated to a series of variations as expected. What is particularly interesting, however, is the way each variation is articulated. In Moscheles, just as in Chopin, the variations are separated by brief orchestral tuttis, which creates structural punctuation. This is not just a matter of form, but of pacing and contrast, of allowing the orchestra to step forward momentarily before yielding again to the piano. We can, of course, debate the merits of the Alexander Variations by Moscheles and the extent to which Chopin may have borrowed its overall design. But as we look at Moscheles' orchestral writing, we see how what may appear today to be a limitation in Chopin's abilities as an orchestrator begins to look more like a conscious inheritance of an existing model adapted to Chopin's own musical language. In Chopin's Variations Opus 2, the theme from Don Giovanni appears at the outset within an introduction shaped by a surprisingly elaborate contrapuntal interplay between the instruments, already suggesting a level of refinement that goes beyond mere imitation of Moscheles' work. The final variation, a polonaise in particular, is a marvelous intuition, not just a brilliant conclusion in musical terms, but a gesture of identity. It's as if in closing the piece this way, Chopin leaves a subtle reminder of his origins, something unmistakably Polish, especially meaningful in the context of performance beyond his homeland. And of course, in the two other works for piano and orchestra from the same period, that reference is no longer implicit, but openly declared. In the fantasy on Polish airs and the Rondo a la Krakowiak, the Krakowiak being a Polish dance originated in Krakow, Polishness is not merely suggested, but placed at the very center of the musical discourse. When he presented pieces with clear references to Poland, it's as if he were declaring, "This is where I come from." And this is extremely significant for understanding how Chopin conceived the form for piano and orchestra, because at this stage, his thinking is inseparable from that of a performer. As a young, ambitious pianist, he's writing not in the abstract, but with very concrete practicalities in mind. The works he composed had to function under the conditions of a touring virtuoso. This meant, among other things, that the orchestral parts could not be overly complex. These were still unpublished works, and one has to imagine Chopin traveling with all the orchestral parts, entirely handwritten, in his luggage. It was not uncommon for him to arrive in a city on the evening before a performance and distribute the parts to the players the next morning. There is at least one instance where, while in Vienna in 1829, the outcome proved simply unsatisfactory, and Chopin chose to abandon the performance altogether. Faced with an orchestra that had not been adequately prepared, he set aside the Rondo in F major and turned instead to improvisation, something far more reliable under these circumstances. He writes about the episode to his parents on August 12, 1829. From my previous letter, you learn, my dearest parents, that I had allowed myself to be persuaded to give a concert. And so yesterday, Tuesday, at 7 o'clock in the evening, I made my bow on the stage of the Royal and Imperial Opera House. The sort of performance that took place yesterday in this theater is called here a musical academy. Since I got nothing out of it, and did not try to get anything, meaning he wasn't getting paid, Count Gallenberg put it on quickly and arranged the program as follows: a Beethoven overture, my Variations, Opus 2, song by Mademoiselle Wertheim, my Rondo, Opus 14, then another song, after which the evening ended with a short ballet. The orchestral accompaniment went so badly at rehearsal that I substituted an improvisation for the rondo. As soon as I appeared on the stage, they started clapping, and the applause was so great after each variation that I could not hear the orchestral tuttes. At the end, they applauded so loudly that I had to come back twice and bow. Although my improvisation did not turn out particularly well, they clapped still louder, and I had to take another bow. I came out the more willingly, since the appreciation of these Germans is worth something. Thus, Würfel, a friend who had interceded to make the concert possible, had brought to a successful conclusion on Tuesday a project that had only been thought of on Sunday. I'm very much indebted to him. Under such circumstances, simplicity in the orchestral writing was not a deficiency but a necessity. More intricate parts would only have created delays, confusion, and additional strain in an already precarious situation. And if that was already a challenge in Vienna, although we can understand how 2 days did not give the orchestra enough time to prepare the Krakowiak, we can imagine what would happen in smaller cities or towns where orchestras may have been less capable. What might later be perceived as thinness or lack of development begins, in this light, to look like a pragmatic solution. A solution shaped by the realities of performance rather than by any limitation of musical imagination. This is even more true in the two concerti which were committed to paper after Chopin returned to Warsaw following his experience in Vienna and other European cities and towns during the summer of 1829. However, there's an even more obvious reason why I think the two concerti are so often judged as being orchestrally weak. It has to do not only with the kind of ensemble Chopin would have had in mind, which differed significantly from the modern orchestra, but also with how the piano itself has changed. In the early 19th century, the string sections in an orchestra were smaller than what we are used to today. Instead of the large symphonic body of strings in a modern orchestra, Chopin would have typically have worked with something closer to 20-25 string players in total, sometimes even fewer depending on the venue and occasion. A typical ensemble might have included something like 4 to 6 first violins, 4 to 6 second violins, 4 violas, 3 celli, and 2 double basses. Compare it to the number of string players in the orchestra during the final round of the Chopin competition in 2025. 12 first violins, 10 second violins, 8 violas, 6 celli, and 4 double basses. This has important consequences. A smaller string body obviously produces less volume and weight, greater transparency, and more space for winds and soloists to be heard. Early 19th century string players played on gut strings, which produced a warmer, softer, and less sustaining sound than modern steel-strung instruments. The attack was gentler and the overall projection more limited. As a result, the entire orchestral texture would have been lighter and more transparent. Now, place woodwind instruments into that context. While it's true that early woodwinds were less powerful than modern ones, they were not necessarily weaker relatively to the strings around them. In fact, because gut strings did not project as strongly, woodwinds could stand out more clearly within the texture, especially in their characteristic registers, particularly double reed instruments such as oboe and bassoon. And this is where it gets interesting. It was while working with some of my students on Chopin's piano concerti that something suddenly became obvious. In 1820s Warsaw, the pianos Chopin was accustomed to were close to the Viennese tradition in action and sound, while also reflecting emerging hybrid influences. They featured lighter action, closer to Viennese pianos, less sustaining power, and a more transparent, delicate tone. It's only after leaving Poland, especially once he settled in Paris, that Chopin became closely associated with French makers like Pleyel and Erard, whose instruments had greater power and a more developed sustaining capacity. How, then, did the instruments that Chopin was accustomed to interact with the orchestral sound he had in mind when he wrote for piano and orchestra? What becomes particularly evident is that the balance we hear today is, in many ways, a distortion. the role of the woodwinds is often undermined, not because they're weaker, but because the modern piano has become overwhelmingly more brilliant and sustaining. Even though woodwinds themselves are now more powerful and even in tone, they still cannot truly compete with the projection and resonance of a modern concert grand. This creates a fundamental imbalance. Chopin's writing frequently gives the winds beautiful solo lines meant to emerge with clarity and character against the lighter, more transparent sound of early 19th century pianos. As a result, melodic lines played by woodwind instruments could speak through the texture naturally, even when the piano was active. Today, however, the solos in the same passages are easily overwhelmed. The sustained resonance of modern arpeggiated figurations fills in the sonic space so completely that what was once a dialogue becomes instead a kind of imbalance. Add to that the greater number of string players on stage playing on steel strung instruments, and we see why the winds would recede into the background. I chose this excerpt from the development section of the first movement of the first piano concerto because it demonstrates how difficult it is, even for exceptional artists such as Vincent Ong, whose listening is remarkably sensitive, to achieve an effective balance between the brilliance of the piano's arpeggiated texture and the solo lines written into the orchestral score. Please forgive the rather pedestrian red markings, which are intended only to highlight the relevant thematic material, much of which is often inaudible. Perhaps it's also that not enough effort is made to make those solos stand out in a more chamber-like manner, where each instrument gets a chance to participate. In that sense, what may appear to be underwritten orchestration is often the result of a changed acoustic reality. Chopin's pianistic textures then depended on a greater degree of permeability, which modern instruments, for all their advantages, do not always allow. And of course, the overall shift in the string sections, certainly adding richness and warmth, but also suppressing the wind section. And so when we think we hear a solo somewhere while the piano unfolds its patterned passage work, for example, arpeggios or more elaborate figurations, that is probably where we should be listening more closely. What seems secondary on the page may in fact be structurally or expressively central. It may not always be a solo in the sense of a line clearly projected above an accompanying mass, but it may well be intended as a voice in dialogue, sometimes with the piano, sometimes with the orchestra itself, rather than as mere harmonic filling. What then is the solution today? Perhaps we have to accept that a pianist should approach this kind of passage work in the piano part more like in chamber music, lighter, more transparent, less physically driven than modern pianistic instinct might suggest. Just because you are the soloist doesn't mean you have to stand out all the time. In this repertoire, it often means knowing when to recede, to let other voices emerge and to take part in a shared texture rather than dominating it. And paradoxically, this can even make these technically demanding passages feel less effortful because they're no longer expected to dominate the texture. At the same time, one might wish that conductors engaged more actively with this issue, encouraging greater dynamic presence from woodwinds and brass when they carry melodic material that goes beyond simple accompaniment. In other words, restoring not just balance, but intentional listening within the ensemble, so that what was once a conversation does not become a monologue.